Hey, modern world history students. We're at the beginning of the Second World War. This is Unit 8. And you will have learned a little bit about what was called the German Blitzkrieg. In class, we'll learn about that. If you haven't learned about it yet, it's fine. But what I need you to know is simply that the Germans had created a new system of fighting that the rest of Europe did not know how to respond to. And in the early weeks of the war, the countries that were being attacked by the Germans using this new system of fighting called Blitzkrieg simply didn't know even how to defend themselves. They couldn't even organize their defense, and they found themselves overwhelmed by the German attack. And that German attack soon turned itself in the direction of France. So we are here at the top of page 9, and we're going to talk about the beginning of the German invasion of France. This is in the spring of 1940. So the French, following World War I, had begun construction of a series of fortresses. And some of these fortresses already existed. You might remember learning about the underground fortresses that protected the French city of Verdun during World War I. Well, those fortresses were still there. Those underground fortresses were still there. And after World War I, and after this area called Alsace-Lorraine, you remember this area called Alsace-Lorraine, where about half the population is ethnically French and the other half is ethnically German. It had been taken from France by Prussia during the Franco-Prussian War, had become part of Germany. It's taken back by the French at the end of World War I. And so the French had begun to prepare to defend that because they figured the Germans will try to take it back at some point. So the French plan for defending that was to take the existing fortresses that had been built prior to World War I, build additional underground fortresses, and connect them into this sort of network of underground fortresses. Underground really meaning sort of partially underground. So this is a section of what we're talking about here, and you can see that it's built into the ground. It's steel reinforced concrete bunkers that were part of this network of defenses that the French built, because they expected that at some point in the future, Germany would certainly try to invade France again and retake Alsace-Lorraine, and the French were determined to defend it. So they had built this entire network of interconnected underground fortresses that were connecting and defending France's border with Germany in Alsace-Lorraine. This became known as the Maginot Line. So the Maginot Line is named after Claude Maginot, who was a civil engineer, military engineer, who designed and oversaw the construction of this network of underground fortresses. And the French almost fantasized about German soldiers, German armies attacking the Maginot Line sort of head on and just being slaughtered in front of the Maginot Line. They imagined that the German armies would fall like snow, falling on warm ground, and just sort of melt away as the Germans launched wave after wave of soldiers into the teeth of this network of fortresses that the French had built, known as the Maginot Line. The French considered the Maginot Line to be impregnable. You could never get past it. Well, they were preparing themselves to fight the last war, really. It's certainly, the Maginot Line was certainly well suited to defend France against a German attack in waves, like going over the top during World War One. But this wasn't World War One anymore, and so the French, although they had devised an excellent system of fortresses to protect them in the event that World War I was fought a second time. Unfortunately, unfortunately for the French, the Maginot Line was not well designed to protect them in what World War II was going to be, which was a much more mobile war, mechanized war, a war that did not uh, depend upon masses of men, but rather upon men and machines. And, particularly, for example, the advent of airborne warfare. So, in World War II, soldiers could arrive on the battlefield by airplane and being dropped out of airplane with parachutes, or even in some cases, wooden gliders. So, an airborne attack is not affected by the Maginot Line. An airborne attack can defeat the Maginot Line because you can simply fly over it and drop your soldiers in behind it. And the Maginot Line had no way to defend itself against an attack from the rear. Um, you can capture French territory simply, by dropping soldiers in over the Maginot Line and preparing the groundwork for an invasion of France that will not go into the teeth of those defenses, but instead will come, as they did during World War One, through Belgium. And so when the Germans turned loose this new, very mobile, rapid attack called Blitzkrieg, and they turned it against the French. It hit the French in a combination of ways. Uh, for one, with airborne assault, German troops, airborne troopers, paratroopers being flown over the Maginot Line and dropped in behind it to lay the groundwork then for a German armored attack, meaning tanks rolling through Belgium. The French army then, it's not to say that the French army was immobile, all right? It's not to say that the French intended to fight this entire war in the exact same manner that they had fought World War One, but the French were a little overcommitted to this idea that they could play defense, and that a static defense, like a defense that didn't move, would be sufficient to protect them against the Germans in this war. Um, but the French did respond, and the British did too, when the Germans plowed into Belgium. And that actually played into the hands of the Germans. So I'm moving you down to the bottom of page 9 now. Now, by this time, it was very, very clear, it was abundantly clear, that the policy of appeasement, which had been promoted, encouraged by Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, that his policy of appeasement, his policy of giving in to Hitler's demands in the hope that eventually Hitler would stop making demands, and in this way you avoid conflict and avoid war, it was very clear that that policy had not just failed, but had been a catastrophic failure. Appeasement had not simply failed in the objective of avoiding war, because now war was here, but appeasement now very obviously had allowed Adolf Hitler to build up Germany's strength to the point where seemingly no one in Europe had an answer for the German army's blitzkrieg style of attack. So appeasement had not just failed in its main objective, which is to avoid war, but it had actually led to a more devastating war. It allowed the Germans to unleash a much more devastating kind of war that was now playing out across the continent of Europe. And because of that, Neville Chamberlain, the prime minister, was forced to resign. He was called out by virtually everybody in the British Parliament and in the British media and in the British public, even members of his own party, demanding that he resign. And so who then will take over as prime minister? Well, there was really only one man, and that was Winston Churchill. He was the only person who, from the very beginning, had been warning against the danger that was posed by Adolf Hitler and the danger that was posed by the rearmament of Germany. And as a matter of fact, because of his stark, dire warnings, speeches that he had made in Britain's House of Commons, which is part of their parliament, had actually been ridiculed and criticized, and he'd been called a warmonger and a crank and a crazy person and paranoid, and that every possible bad thing that could be said about him had been said, because he, from the very beginning, had been saying we've got to be careful about Hitler and we can't let him rearm Germany and we'll pay the price for this. We cannot appease him. He had been opposed to appeasement. So now, since really almost everybody else in the government had favored appeasement, now with appeasement in shambles and Germany rolling all over everybody in Europe, the only person left in the British government who had anybody's confidence, who anybody had any confidence in, who had any kind of credibility left, was Winston Churchill. And so the king asked him to serve as prime minister. And in May of 1940, Winston Churchill took over as prime minister of Great Britain. He's honest with the British people. In his first speech as prime minister, he tells them, I have nothing to offer but blood and toil and tears and sweat. And we have before us an ordeal of the most grievous kind. We have before us many long months of struggle and suffering. So unlike Neville Chamberlain, who was always sort of happy and positive, and everything's going to be okay because we're appeasing Adolf Hitler, um, Winston Churchill is honest with the British people. He levels with the British people. We're in a position that's now very grave, right? It's not going to be over in days or weeks. We have many long months of struggle and suffering ahead of us. It's going to take huge sacrifices now to defeat Adolf Hitler. There will be massive loss of life. Our lives will be disrupted. Our cities will be attacked, right? He's warning the British people about this. But then he says to them, you ask what is our policy? Our policy is to wage war against a monstrous tyranny, to wage war with all the strength and all the might that God can give us. You ask what is our aim? This I can answer in one word, Churchill said. It is victory. Victory at all cost, victory in spite of all terror, victory however long and hard the road may be, because without victory there can be no survival. So he says to the British people, yes, this is going to be extremely difficult. It will require enormous sacrifices and enormous disruption of our lives. But I'm telling you, we're going to win. We're going to fight. We're not going to appease. We're going to fight and we're going to win. And the reason we're going to win is we have no other option. Uh, Defeat will not give us relief from Hitler. Defeat will lead to the destruction of our society by Hitler. We will beat him because there's no other choice. So that's what Winston Churchill told the British people. It was a very different message than they had been getting from Neville Chamberlain, and it actually inspired the British people and motivated the British people. He tells the British people, I'm going to need your help. I will need your blood and your toil and your tears and your sweat. And he was right. In fact, he was right almost immediately, because although there was an army of 200,000 British deployed in France to try to help the French defend France, they were suddenly cut off. The German blitzkrieg, the German rapid tank attack, which had plunged through Belgium and into northern France, the Germans bypassed the British army and elements of the French army as well, and then came back and cut them off. So the British army and part of the French army was tucked in here at a place called Dunkirk. And Dunkirk is a port. You can see it's right there along what's called the English Channel. So the gray area here is water, right? The Atlantic Ocean is all surrounding this. And this little neck of the Atlantic Ocean that separates the island of Great Britain from the rest of the continent of Europe, that little neck of the ocean is called the English Channel. Dunkirk is a port in France, although just barely in France. It's really right on the border of Belgium and France. And it's a port on the English Channel. And there, the British army and about 200,000 of the French army as well were cut off by the German attack and trapped. The Germans bypassed them and then turned and cut them off and surrounded them at Dunkirk. And there was really nothing to do for them. There was nowhere for them to go. And so Churchill, he takes over as prime minister, and immediately he's confronted by this crisis. If something isn't done to rescue those 400,000 British and French soldiers from Dunkirk, 200,000 British, 200,000 French, if something isn't done to rescue them, they're going to be destroyed. They're going to be wiped out. The Germans are going to close in on them and destroy them and kill them all or capture them all. And this will be extremely demoralizing, a horrific defeat at the opening of the war. And so Churchill ordered the British Navy, the Royal Navy, as it's called in Britain, to begin to evacuate British and French troops from Dunkirk. But there were major problems with the evacuation. Dunkirk was a port, but it was not a large port. There were only a few docks where these big British warships could come in, big troop transport ships could come in and load up British and French troops. And so as a result of that, because there were such limited port facilities, the evacuation started off very slowly. And in the first few days of the evacuation, the British Navy, the Royal Navy, was only able to evacuate a small number of British soldiers, only about 7,000 per day. Well, there's 400,000 British soldiers there. So at 7,000 per day, it would take weeks and weeks and weeks, months to evacuate at that pace. And by that time, the Germans will have closed in and killed them all off. And so Churchill now called upon the British people. He said to the British people in a what he called a special emergency request, a radio broadcast, he said to the British people in southern England, if you have a boat, doesn't matter what kind of a boat. It could be a fishing boat. It could be a passenger ferry. It could be a garbage scow. It could be a pleasure boat that you just take out like a sporting boat. It doesn't matter. If you've got it and it floats and it's got a motor, please go across the English Channel to Dunkirk, load up as many British and French soldiers as you can, bring them back to your port in England, and then turn around and do it again. And do it again and again and again until we get those soldiers home. He promised these civilians. These are civilians. These aren't naval officers. These aren't members of the British Navy or any other part of the British military. These are civilians with their civilian boats. And he promised them the Royal Air Force, the British Air Force, will keep the skies over the English Channel clear of German planes, which was a really important because if German planes appeared in the skies over the English Channel while these defenseless civilian boats were trying to evacuate soldiers out of Dunkirk, the German planes could simply attack and destroy these boats and kill not only the soldiers on board, but the civilians trying to rescue them. And so Churchill promised these British civilians, our Air Force will fight the Germans in the skies over the Channel and will keep the skies clear of German planes so that you will be as safe as we can make you. And it was quite a remarkable thing. This fleet of irregular, diverse boats piloted by civilians who were putting their lives at risk to save the army began making its way across the Channel, and they began loading up British and French soldiers. And in a period of 7 days, they evacuated over 300,000 soldiers. Almost every British soldier who was trapped at Dunkirk was rescued and transported back to England. Half of the French soldiers, before the Germans finally closed in and finished them off, more than half of the French soldiers were rescued by British civilians with boats and transported back to England. It was certainly one of the most unusual and almost miraculous. It's sometimes called the miracle of Dunkirk. Naval operations in the history of humanity. And this was exactly what Churchill meant. He wasn't kidding when he said to the British people, I need your blood, your toil, your tears, your sweat. This is the only way we'll win the war. And the British people saw immediately that they could have an impact on the outcome of the war, that it wasn't just soldiers and sailors and airmen who were going to do the fighting in this war, but that civilians were going to have a role to play if Britain was going to survive. And they did survive. And Churchill admitted after the evacuation of Dunkirk, look at the piles and piles of equipment that all these British and French soldiers had to leave behind. They couldn't bring that stuff on the civilian boats with them. They needed the space for more people. And the German army gloried in the way that the English and the French had abandoned all their stuff, right? And they were, in order to escape, they had abandoned all of their gear. And Churchill admitted, you don't win wars by retreating. But at the same time, there was something to celebrate in getting the army away. And think about how much worse at a time when everybody in Europe had nothing but self-doubt about how they were going to handle the Germans in this new way of fighting war that no one seemed to be able to defend against. How much worse would it have been, right, if those British troops and French troops who were evacuated from Dunkirk had all been killed or captured at the beginning of the war? So that was a great sort of triumph for the Allies. It was a morale booster, especially for the British. But it meant, I'm sorry, I'm still at the bottom of page 9, but it meant now that there was sort of no one left to help defend France against this German onslaught. And so very, very quickly, the German army closed in on the city of Paris, and they accomplished what they never accomplished in World War One. Remember that in World War One, twice, at the beginning and at the end, the German army had gotten very close to capturing the city of Paris, but in World War Two, they actually succeeded. And as a matter of fact, the French, seeing their army just completely routed by the Germans, just demoralized and fleeing with their lives in the face of the German attack, the French government declared Paris to be an open city. In other words, they told the Germans, we will not defend the city of Paris, because they felt that if they fought for Paris, the Germans would certainly bomb it with their airplanes and bombard it with their artillery, and that the city and city would be destroyed, its civilian population, so many of them, thousands killed. So the French declared that they would not defend the city of Paris, and they surrendered. They surrendered to the Germans in June of 1940, and German forces marched into the city of Paris unopposed and took possession of the city. And Hitler, of course, arrived in Paris. He traveled around the city. This was a moment of supreme triumph for him, because remember that in World War One he had fought in the German army on the Western Front, and he too had gotten so close with the rest of the Germans to capturing the city. But then, of course, the tide of the war had turned. Hitler had been injured, hit with mustard gas, spends the rest of the war in the hospital. The tide of the war turned, and Germany lost the war. Now Hitler, this was a moment of supreme triumph for him. Finally, revenge on France. And he even arranged that when the armistice was signed at the end of World War One, the generals had met to sign the armistice in this railroad car outside of Paris, and that railroad car had been turned into a sort of a museum display, celebrating the end of World War One and the French Allied victory in World War One. Now Adolf Hitler arranged for the French generals to surrender to Germany, to sign the surrender documents in the very same railroad car, to complete the reversal of history, which is what Hitler intended to do. He intended to reverse the outcome of World War One, and for the moment he had done it, a moment of triumph for him. And so he toured Paris, gets his picture taken in front of the Eiffel Tower, visited the tomb of Napoleon Bonaparte, thinking on how, Napoleon had taken years to build this European empire. And in just a matter of months or even weeks, the German army look at it. Look at how much of Europe, all the red area on the map, look at how much of Europe German armies had captured in just a matter of months and weeks. Hitler, it seemed, was outdoing Napoleon Bonaparte in how rapidly he had been able to conquer Europe. And at this time, Hitler arranged for the southern part of France to be governed by what's called a collaborationist government. Collaborationist is where you get someone who's from that country, but who agrees to work with you to help govern it. So you'll see that the northern part of France, after the French surrender, after the fall of France in June of 1940, the northern part of France, the part that borders England, the part that borders the Atlantic Ocean, that was now placed under direct German control. It'll be administered by the German army. The southern part of France will not be. It will be governed as what's called a collaborationist government. It will be governed by a French government and led by a French person who has been agreeable to working with and doing the work of the Nazis for them. That man was Marshal Philippe Pétain, the man on the left here shaking hands with Adolf Hitler. This is really tragic. Philippe Pétain was one of the heroes of the French war effort in World War I, arguably France's greatest hero of World War I. But now, with France defeated, he will sort of ruin his entire reputation by becoming a man who will collaborate with Adolf Hitler and who will govern the southern part of France, which becomes known as Vichy France, because its capital was a small town called Vichy. So Vichy France will be the part of France that is not occupied by the Germans, but is sort of self-governed, but governed by Marshal Pétain, who works with Hitler and does what Hitler tells him to do. After the war, Philippe Pétain will be accused of treason and found guilty of treason against France for his collaboration with Adolf Hitler, sentenced to death. But his death sentence will be commuted to life in prison in light of the good things he had done for France in World War I. But with that, the fall of France was complete. And Hitler's conquest of Western Europe really was complete as well. And as I said, it was a huge shock to everybody around the world to see how rapidly this new technique for fighting, blitzkrieg, invented by the Germans, had conquered even the powerful French army, and had sent the British army fleeing back to Britain. And at this moment, people just didn't know. There was no reason to think that Hitler and the Germans could ever be stopped. So that's the lesson for this Ed puzzle. And obviously, you know that's not how things ultimately played out. We'll start to talk about the mistakes that Hitler made and the things that Germany did wrong, which ultimately turned the tide of the war against them. But that's for another lesson. So until then, take care of yourselves, be healthy, and be safe. So long, modern world history students.